we were doing a recap, and I think we got to the abomination of desolation and the need for immediate flight. Isn't that right?
Yes. Flee the safety of Jerusalem. That's what I wrote last, which is the
Right,
it's against what they would want to do.
right, right. So he says that for then there will be great tribulation, such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be. And if those days had not been shortened, no human being would be saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be shortened. Then if anyone says to you, behold, here is the Christ, or there he is, do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and show great signs and wonders, so as to lead astray, if possible, even the elect. Behold, I have told you beforehand, so if they say to you, behold, he is in the wilderness, do not go out. They say, behold, he is in the inner rooms, do not believe it. For as the lightning comes from the east and shines as far as the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Wherever the body is, there the eagles will be gathered together. So the so the question here is for this section immediately after the section about flight is how does this relate to the previous passage and what is it about? So we have the word tribulation in verse 25 as we have the word tribulation in verse 9. So there's a warning here about tribulation, and then there's a warning here about false messiahs. So that is a repetition of his previous warnings about apostasy, about false messiahs, about don't be deceived, and about persecution. So repetition, typically this is, most commentators treat this as, a whole new thing that applies to the second coming or whatever. But the thing is that repetition is very common in apocalyptic texts. So in the interpretation of the book of Revelation, we see that each of the sets of signs, um, the trumpet judgments, the bowl judgments, those are all repetitions of one another, told from different points of view, but they're the same basic set of events. So most interpreters interpret them as consecutive or chronological, and here most interpreters, interpret this section as chronologically after the previous section, but that actually is incorrect. So what is Jesus trying to say here? If we go back and look at the signs, the he's identified um, a number of them. We spoke, I think, about the 8 signs. So the first was false messiahs. Second was wars and rumors of war. Third was famines and earthquakes. Third and fourth. The fifth was persecution. The sixth was apostasy. The seventh was the gospel preached worldwide. And the eighth was the desolating sacrilege. So basically, he returns to uh, sign 1, the false messiahs, and sign 5, persecution. So why would he do that?
I think the false messiahs are an easy one to get pulled into. So to be an extra reminder about those, because it's very easy to get pulled into false messiahs without realizing that's what you're doing.
Right, right. False messiahs are very dangerous. I mean, we see that throughout Christianity today, not only with cults like what was that Heaven's Gate, where and um, the, um, the Jim Jones thing in Guyana, and the Waco people, but also false messiahs and false leaders, in terms of contemporary prophets of God who spew lies and nonsense and bigotry and racism and hatred and are prophets of God. So false
And also
messiahs,
godlike adoration of money or other things.
right, right, right. The Joel Osteens of the world. Yeah. So very prevalent in false messiahs and false prophets and false leaders are very, very prevalent in Christianity. So what about tribulation?
I feel like
Persecution?
that one will like be present in the life of the church through the whole time. So they're giving like extra emphasis on that one. Like you're gonna face persecution. Persecution?
Uh-huh.
But
Well, it occurs throughout the
the way
life
that
of
Jesus was.
it occurs throughout the life of the church, but the big thing is that the church has become sufficiently large that it can withstand persecution, but
But in the early days, it couldn't.
in the early days it couldn't necessarily stand persecution. And so, in China, for example, when the church is persecuted, we see people continuing to defend the faith with despite persecution. And in general, when Christianity is persecuted for legitimate reasons, we
Mm-hmm.
see Christians trying to defend the faith. When the church is persecuted is the wrong word. When the church is, uh, what is the word?
Well, it's attacked.
When the church is attacked because of its own failures, sins, and shortcomings, then we see that much less so. But but uh, but when the church is persecuted for its righteousness, then we typically see that people that although there may be a defection and an apostasy, there are also a large portion of the church that holds firm and doesn't betray the faith. So so in many ways, Jesus has delivered the eight signs, and if we look at them, the false messiahs. So he's talking about the signs that will precede the destruction of the temple, right? One of them is false messiahs. That poses a real danger because people will be led astray. And he begins this whole thing with, beware that you are not deceived, right? And what do false messiahs do? They deceive.
Deceive.
So these are deceivers,
Mm-hmm.
a real danger. Wars and rumors of war is a historically specific sign to Pax Romana, but there's nothing particularly threatening in any broader sense about it, nothing particularly you can do. Famines and earthquakes are beyond human control. Persecution poses a real danger because it gives rise to apostasy and it gives rise to defection, in addition to the fact that people are killed. So you have, two sources of loss of believers, of loss of disciples of Christ, to death and to apostasy. Then apostasy is the next one, and that typically is conditioned by false messiahs and persecution. Then the seventh sign, the gospel preached worldwide, that's going to happen. That's not going to undermine the church. And then you have the desolating sacrilege, and that's, sort of the point of the whole thing. That's where the Olivet Discourse leads to. So the question is, how does the church get to the desolating sacrilege? How does the church survive until it reaches the desolating sacrilege? And it survives by weathering the tribulation, weathering persecution, and by recognizing and not succumbing to false messiahs. So the focus here is on Jesus' concern about the things that can destroy the church before the destruction of the temple. So that's why this is here. That's why he's returning to it. That's why he's emphasizing this, especially out of the two of the signs out of the 8 signs.
Boy, how many times have I read the Olivet Discourse and never caught that? This is really good to know, to have it pointed out.
Mm-hmm.
So the 8th sign was desolation?
Yeah, the abomination of desolation. So the Roman armies surrounding Jerusalem and the temple. So, so he's saying, so behold, if they say he is in the wilderness, do not go out. If he is in the inner rooms, do not believe it. So you do not have to search for the Messiah. You don't have to wonder if the Messiah is here or there or anywhere. The Messiah is not going to be a mysterious figure. The coming of the Messiah will be very public. And so Jesus moves here in verse 27 to a contrast. So whereas, the Messiah is in the wilderness, the Messiah is by the Jordan, the Messiah is in some basement, the Messiah is in a room, the Messiah is someplace. When the Messiah actually comes, when the Parousia happens, it will be very public. So, for as the lightning comes from the east and shines as far as the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. And Jesus here uses the word Parousia, which is the same word used by the disciples in asking the second question, what will be the sign of your coming? Where they use Parousia, and of the end of the age. But this is a parenthetical. This verse 27 is a parenthetical. It's really just dropped in by way of contrast with the Messiah who you have to go searching for and have to find and have to wonder whether this clown really is the Messiah. So then he returns to the point, which is wherever the body is, there the eagles will be gathered. Another translation, another word, basically the same word, eagles or vultures. It's difficult to decide which one it is, but it doesn't really matter. because he's back to the destruction of the focusing on the destruction of the temple, not on the Perusia. And so we have the vultures who would be the Roman armies waiting to swoop in and destroy the Carian, who are these people inside Jerusalem who are really fighting with one another and destroying one another and eating one another. I mean, that they, in a literal sense, are Carian. And or the eagles, which is the same thing, the Roman army marching to the banner of a dirty bird, and not a dirty bird, an unclean bird. So, so with that sentence, he's back. With that verse, he's back to the destruction of the temple. Right. So,
Mm-hmm.
so now we basically, so the disciples have asked, when will this be? And Jesus has provided the signs to point to when. With the last one being the same as the abomination of desolation, wherever the body is, there the eagles will be gathered, right? So we have this image of these, eagles waiting to swoop down on the carrion, which is in many ways a perfect description of a siege, right? They're outside a walled city waiting to swoop in.
Mm-hmm.
And so that imagery also suggests that the temple is still standing because they're outside waiting to swoop in. So, in verse 29, immediately after the tribulation of those days, so immediately after, this follows
The
immediately.
destruction.
So
Mm-hmm.
we have the vultures or the eagles surrounding the walled city, and immediately after the tribulation of those days. The sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, stars will fall from heaven, powers of heaven will be shaken. Then the sign of the Son of Man, uh, then will appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. So immediately after that comes a darkening of the sun, moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from heaven, etc., etc., right? So this is the moment that the temple falls. So the temple has been destroyed, which also means that temple Judaism has been destroyed, which means in turn that the a period, a major period in salvation history has ended, and God's relationship to his people has been redefined in a major way, that God's blessing flows now through a remnant, and that remnant is the group of Jewish followers of Jesus who establish the Christian church. So this is a major, turning point in salvation history. I mean, typically in Christian periodization of history, there are really only two periods: the old period, the old covenant, the new covenant, and the period of the new covenant, or also the church age will be terminated by the second coming. So, so this is a major turning point, a major uh, change, a major discontinuity in salvation history and therefore in human history. So the if we go back to chapter 16, where the Pharisees and the Sadducees ask Jesus to show them a sign from heaven. They're especially expecting this. They're expecting Jesus to darken the sun, to cause the moon to not give its light, to cause the stars to fall from heaven. They're looking for cosmic signs because in all of the apocalyptic prophecies of the Old Testament, the day of the Lord is accompanied by these apocalyptic signs. But in fact, the apocalyptic signs are not real. And Jesus isn't producing the apocalyptic signs, not necessarily because he can't, but because that's not the point. Those signs are symbols, and the real sign is his opposition themselves. They're the sign. So I kind of find it really interesting that many Christians are looking for signs and, projecting these same signs. And what that really suggests is that they really need to be looking in a mirror at themselves, because as the Pharisees and the Sadducees were, they themselves were the sign. So when we go looking for signs, then we would be very, very well served to look in a mirror, I think, and bring ourselves to a place of repentance, because we're obviously not there. So we have this cosmic imagery. So when we looked at the cosmic imagery, we had seen it applied to the fall of Babylon. We had seen it applied to Edom, which then, after whatever, became Idumea. So the cosmic imagery is always applied to a political upheaval, to a major political change. So the fall of the Babylonian Empire was one of the world's great empires, and was destroyed by the Medo-Persian Empire.
So you said the cosmic imagery always refers to a major upheaval in human history. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's a symbol. It's a symbol that's something major, of cosmic significance, a political upheaval or a historical upheaval of cosmic significance has occurred. And so the temple has fallen. And that is an event of cosmic significance. That is the event that vindicates Christ, that indicates that Christ was the Messiah, whether we want to believe it or not. And remember that this prophecy, the Olivet Discourse, is delivered, although many interpreters will dispute that, was delivered before the destruction of the temple. So this is a prophetic discourse. And it's also unusual. You'll remember in our very first class, we talked about prophecy, that there are two types of prophecy, that there's typological prophecy and that there's predictive prophecy. Very little prophecy in the Old or New Testaments is predictive. But this is predictive prophecy. Jesus is focusing on a specific event which he says will occur within the lifetime of some of those hearing his words. it's believed when the temple did fall, probably only John was alive out of his immediate disciples. I'm actually not at all sure when Thomas died, but um, but it did occur within the generation, given a generation of about 40 years of his disciples. Um, so a major cataclysmic event that signals a major transformation that accelerates the separation of the Christian church or the disciples of Christ from Judaism, that marks the end of temple Judaism, which is the expression of the old covenant, that marks the full um, validation of the new covenant. So in many ways, I mean, living 2,000 years after the event, we can barely appreciate the full significance of the destruction of the temple, and the for religious Jews, the sense of anguish and loss and complete um, soul searching and pain and misery and questioning that it caused. It really marks the end of a very important age and the beginning of a new one. So we have this cosmic imagery which points to a political, social, historical upheaval. And then in verse 30, then will appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and all the tribes of the earth will mourn. And they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. So then will appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. It's not quite known what the sign of the Son of Man in heaven is, but there are some interesting possibilities. In the patristic tradition, the general feeling was that the sign of the Son of Man is the cross, that the sign of the cross will appear in heaven very much like the cross appeared to Constantine before his decisive battle, wherever it was. So that's Jerome's interpretation, that's Chrysostom, that's Theophylact. But both Josephus and Tacitus report heavenly signs at the time of the fall of Jerusalem. And interestingly, Tacitus is a Roman historian. Tacitus was both anti-Christian and anti-Jewish. So Tacitus writes, omens had occurred which this nation, prone to superstition, but hating all religious rites, he's talking about the Jews, did not deem it lawful to expiate by offering and sacrifice. There had been seen hosts joining battle in the skies, the fiery gleam of arms, the temple illuminated by a sudden radiance from the clouds. The doors of the inner shrine were suddenly thrown open, and a voice of more than mortal tone was heard to cry that the gods were departing. At the same instant, there was a mighty stir as of departure. Some few put a fearful meaning on these events, but in most there was a firm persuasion that in the ancient records of their priests was contained a prediction of how, at this very time, the East was to grow powerful, and rulers coming from Judea were to acquire universal empire. So they interpreted this all to mean God was on their side. These mysterious prophecies had pointed to Vespasian and Titus, but the common people, with the usual blindness of ambition, had interpreted these mighty destinies of themselves and could not be brought, even by disasters, to believe the truth. And so he's saying the prophecies point Vespasian was Titus's father and was the general in charge of the Roman Jerusalem war before he abandoned the battle to become emperor. And so then General Titus was his son and continued the assault on Jerusalem. And it was General Titus who successfully overran the city and destroyed the temple.
Hmm.
So that's Tacitus, who was not a big supporter of either Jews or Christians. And Josephus says, thus were the miserable people persuaded by these deceivers, and such as belied God himself, while they did not attend nor give credit to the signs that were so evident, and did so plainly foretell their future desolation, but like men infatuated, without either eyes to see or minds to consider, did not regard the denunciations that God made to them. Thus there was a star resembling a sword which stood over the city, and a comet that continued a whole year. Thus also before the Jews' rebellion, and before those commotions which preceded the war, when the people were come in great crowds to the feast of unleavened bread, on the 8th day of the month Nisan, and at the 9th hour of the night, so great a light shone around the altar in the holy house that it appeared to be bright daytime, which lasted for half an hour. This light seemed to be a good sign to the unskillful, but was so interpreted by the sacred scribes so as to portend those events that followed immediately upon it. At the same festival also a heifer, as she was led by the high priest to be sacrificed, brought forth the lamb in the midst of the temple. Moreover, the eastern gate of the inner court of the temple, which was of brass and vastly heavy, and had been with difficulty shut by 20 men, and rested upon a basis armed with iron, and had bolts fastened very deep into the firm floor, which was there made of one entire stone, was seen to be opened of its own accord about the 6th hour of the night. Now those that kept watch in the temple came hereupon running to the captain of the temple and told him of it, who then came up thither and not without great difficulty was able to shut the gate again. This also appeared to the vulgar to be a very happy prodigy, as if God thereby opened them the gates of happiness. Well, we can stop there. So there were some signs preceding the destruction of the temple that were reported by both Josephus and by Tacitus. So that may be the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. And then he says, then all the tribes of the earth will mourn. And that's a bad translation. When we hear tribes, what do we think of?
Well, you think of the 12 tribes of Israel.
Right, you think of the 12 tribes of Israel. And so it says tribes of the tribes of the earth will mourn. So guess what word is used for what word in Greek is used there?
Is that logos?
No, logos is word.
Word, yeah.
Jesus is the logos.
Oh, what's that other one?
It's gay.
Okay.
So
And is it G-A-E?
Ghai.
G-H-A-I.
So it's the promised land. So it's not the tribes of the earth at all who are mourning.
Mm,
It's the tribes of the land, of the promised land. It's the tribes of Israel. It's a mistranslation or a poor translation. Although we consistently see this poor translation in a lot of the New Testament and particularly in the book of Revelation. Gay is used extensively in the book of Revelation. It's always translated earth or world or whatever, which really obviously the book of Revelation is predominantly also about a prophecy of the destruction of the temple.
Mm.
It's not this whole book about the second coming and the horrors to which we're going to be inflicted, subjected, and whatever. So all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they did, because from the perspective of Temple Judaism, history has come to an end. So what do you do when history comes to an end? And that's, unspeakably tragic. It's more than a bit disorienting. That's a really mild way of expressing it. After all of the tribes of the earth will mourn, he refers to Daniel. They will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. The word there, the coming there, is not parousia. And you notice that it follows, where is he coming to? Since it's drawn from Daniel, he's not coming to earth, he's coming to the Ancient of Days. And so traditionally, that verse in Daniel was interpreted as the vindication of the Son of Man, was interpreted to be the Israelites as a people. And they're being presented to the Ancient of Days, who we would, in Trinitarian theology, would identify as God the Father, as a sign of the vindication of Israel and of the restoration of Israel from exile. So Jesus appropriates that imagery and that concept of vindication for himself. And so this is a reference to his vindication. So he'll be presented to the Ancient of Days in in the terminology of Christian theology. He takes his place at the right hand of the Father. So it's a public pronunciation of Jesus' vindication, the destruction of the temple. It's a confirmation. The notion, in some sense, is that a heavenly phenomenon has an earthly expression. The heavenly phenomenon is that Jesus is vindicated. Jesus is confirmed to be the Messiah, and the earthly manifestation of that is that the temple falls. So, so Jesus is vindicated before God the Father. So this doesn't refer to Jesus coming to earth at all. So we have vindication. He will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to another. So the
That reminds me of Revelations,
mm-hmm,
where it talks about this in Revelations.
it's also in the Old Testament, it reflects the regathering of a people, of the Israelites, after a period of tribulation. And so it's also, in some sense, resurrection language,
Mm.
gathering the elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to another. So the trumpet call is from Isaiah chapter 27. There's a great trumpet to summon those lost in the diaspora to Jerusalem. But Jerusalem is in ruins and the temple is gone. So that kind of imagery is no longer relevant. What is relevant, what this is really talking about, is the gathering together of the church. The great trumpet summons not those lost in the diaspora, but those in the church who are scattered throughout the world into one cohesive whole. So this is a prophecy about the formation of the church. And here, this portion of the Olivet Discourse is typological. So, are there questions about this? Are there comments? Are there thoughts?
Tell me how that is also resurrection language.
Well, the angels are gathering those who have been dispersed. Those who have been dispersed are, in some sense, they're lost. They're,
Right. But so
as
it's
though.
not referring to Christ's resurrection.
No, it's not referring to
Okay,
Christ's
that's what I
resurrection.
wanted to
No,
verify.
Oh.
it's
Hmm.
recurring. It refers really to the rise of the church from
The
temple
resurrection of the church.
from
Yeah.
temple Judaism, right? So the angels are gathering together the church from the four winds.
Hmm.
So in the Mass, we always talk about how the church is spread throughout the world but is one. This is that same basic concept,
Hmm.
Okay.
except that
I
in
just
some.
wanted
Go ahead.
to verify that we weren't referring to Christ's resurrection in that.
Right.
Thank
No.
you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because I was
That's.
kind of going, wait a minute, no, this is
Yeah. That's a good point. No, I wasn't referring to Christ's resurrection. No. So in some sense, the so if we look at Paul's writings and look at Acts, we can see that there's no small amount of friction between Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians, right? There's continues to be tensions, and Paul accuses Peter of behaving one way before Gentiles and behaving another way before Jewish Christians, and so despite being all being disciples of Christ, with the temple still standing, there's in some sense mixed allegiance, right? If you're a Christian Jew, you're likely to still be focused on the temple. If you're a Gentile Christian, and I mean, on the one hand, there were some Gentile Christians that embraced sort of the Mosaic law and Judaism more passionately than Jewish Christians, but on the whole, that wasn't the case at all, and so that's kind of a point of division. And so, with the destruction of the temple, that point of division is, rather dramatically eliminated. And it may not go away immediately, but it is a gathering of the elect. And also notice that earlier he said if those days had not been shortened, no human being would be saved. And he had said that there will be a great tribulation such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be. So remember, we're not talking about body counts. We're not talking about what we perceive to be, the degree of suffering. He's not saying that there's not going to be enormous suffering or even greater suffering. There won't be more deaths. The Holocaust won't be a more horrific event. He's talking about all of this from the viewpoint of salvation history and from the uh, ultimate goal of God's plan, which is to bring about a reunification of heaven and earth, which requires a certain measure of human cooperation, and particularly requires the participation of the church. So the Great Tribulation, such as has not been from the beginning of the world and never will be, is caused by the fact that if the church is destroyed, that the church could have been destroyed during this period, that the church probably came close to destruction in this period, and that would have marked a major defeat of God's plan for salvation. So this is narrated from the viewpoint of salvation history, not from the viewpoint of general human history. And similarly, so, related to that is the fact that these days have been shortened. They've been shortened by God's supernatural intervention to make them shorter. And, so how did that happen? We see that God doesn't beat people over the head. God doesn't push. God doesn't prod. What he does is withdraws blessing and allows things to run their natural course that they would run if God were not present upholding all things. And so let's take a quick look at Hebrews, the very beginning, chapter 1, verse 1.
How about if we start right here at Hebrews next time?
Okay,
I'll write it down.
we can start at Hebrews 1:1.